Bad movies. Movies that try so hard to be appealing to a small or broad demographic, only to fail so miserably and embarrassingly despite the amount of effort that went into their making, or lack thereof. Some worse than others. There are many traits that can deem a movie to be bad or of poor quality. Dreadful acting, weak writing, abysmal effects, slow pace, poor directing, to name a few. Sometimes a movie can suffer from an amalgam of these topics, making it absolutely painful to watch, and even cause it to be listed among the worst movies of all time. Movies that fall under this category are often referred to as Z movies. Some of the most well-known Zs are Glen or Glinda, Plan 9 from Outer Space, Manos, The Hands of Fate, Troll 2, The Room, Mac and Me, Superman 4, and Battlefield Earth, among many, many others. Out of all the Zs that usually find a spot on the worst ever list, my personal favorite is Superman 4, The Quest for Peace. How can one have a favorite bad movie, though? Well, what these films all have in common is that they aren't just bad, they're so bad that they're considered highly enjoyable to audiences. When we watch them, we uncover the source of their entertainment not from the creative, artistic values that they visually present to us, but actually from the degree in which they can be mocked or laughed at. Today, that concept brought us one of the most prime examples of a cinematic failure. Ballistic, Ecks vs. Sever. Released on September 20th, 2002, the movie was universally panned by critics, who quickly labeled it one of the worst films ever made. Currently, the movie holds a rare 0% rating on Rotten Tomatoes, based on 117 collected reviews, all of which are completely negative. If that sounds like a pretty bad sign, believe me, it is, because that currently makes it the worst reviewed movie of all time on Rotten Tomatoes. The critical reception is actually slightly worse than Battlefield Earth, which came out just 2 years prior to Ballistic. Why am I pointing that out, you ask? Well, because both of these Z movies were produced by the now-defunct Franchise Pictures, two big-budgeted, overhyped pieces of cinematic garbage made just 2 years apart from each other by the exact same studio. To further emphasize their existence, the two movies bombed so badly at the box office that Franchise Pictures was put out of business in 2007, just 5 years after Ballistic's release. Battlefield Earth earned just $29.7 million against a budget that was supposed to be $75 million, plus $20 million in marketing. However, following an investigation by the FBI, it was discovered that the producers only spent $44 million on the movie, which opened the door for a lawsuit by one of the companies that helped finance the picture, and successfully sued Franchise Pictures for more than $120 million. Ballistic cost roughly $70 million to make, along with another $20 million in marketing, and only grossed $19.9 million. Both box office performances were a major financial loss for Franchise Pictures, but it was the Battlefield Earth lawsuit that really did them in. But why did Ballistic tank so badly from both a critical and financial standpoint? It had a huge budget, two very well-known actors, Antonio Banderas and Lucy Liu, playing the titular characters, and as any fan of the Michael Bay Transformers movies might like, were treated with a buttload of action in the beginning, middle, and end of the movie, with tons and tons of explosions every couple of minutes to boot. Where in the world did this concept go wrong? Is it really as bad as the critics claim? Would I recommend it, even as a so bad it's good type of film? Let's take a look. 7 years after his wife was killed in an explosion, former FBI agent Jeremiah Ecks, played by Antonio Banderas, is called back onto the force to solve a rather important case with his professional skills. In exchange for accepting and completing the job, he'll be rewarded with information about the current whereabouts of his wife, Vin, played by Talisa Soto, who, to his absolute shock, is actually still alive. Following a very brief rejection to the offer, he eventually relents, and is immediately escorted to Vancouver to begin his life-changing mission, a mission that also includes the discovery of an enemy he once thought was a trustworthy ally, and soon discovers an ally he once assumed to be an enemy. After being shown a security recording of the kidnapping of the son of the DIA director, Robert Gant, played by Greg Henry, Ecks learns that he also has to contend with a mysterious adversary by the name of Sever, played by Lucy Liu. They don't actually know her name at this point, but we, the audience, can easily piece that together. Sever is a highly trained assassin gone rogue who kidnapped Gant's son for reasons that were still in the dark. Before any sympathy could be shed, it's revealed that Gant had recently stolen a highly advanced piece of machinery from Germany and smuggled it into North America after demolishing the building that housed the production of the aforementioned instrument. Of course, at this point, it's only speculation, but several security photos of one of Gant's goons at the scene of the robbery gave the FBI a good reason to believe that Gant was behind the theft of the advanced item. And just what was it that he stole? It's called Soft Kill, a microscopic, undetectable robot that, when somehow injected into the body of a person, is endowed with a poison that can cause the host to die from a heart attack. Later on, it's learned that Gant was able to secretly import this tiny instrument across the ocean by placing it in his son's body, without the latter even knowing about it. Heh, Father of the Year right there. With all that said and done, X's new task is to prep himself to not only track down Gant's missing son and retrieve that gene-sized bot, but also find out what else he can use to put an end to Gant's secret agenda, and especially to discover more about Sever, and see if she's actually this murderous assassin she's assumed to be. If he's successful in his mission, the FBI will aid him in tracking down his wife, then, with all the data they currently have. Sounds like a pretty interesting story, right? I mean, on the surface, the concept sounds like the movie should have been one of the most compelling, thought-provoking, and enjoyable action dramas of the past few decades. Even the theatrical trailer seems pretty gripping every time I watch it. Well, like a lot of other movies with interesting plots, its failure lies in its execution, which is where Ballistic failed in a most notoriously tragic blunder. Almost nothing, and I do mean nothing, works in Ballistic Ecks vs. Sever. The plot, for instance, makes little to no sense whatsoever. I know I may have described the story like I knew what I was talking about, but believe me, when I was preparing my script for this review, I struggled for hours trying to come up with a few concise details to provide a synopsis for the plot. Why did it take so long, you ask? Well, for starters, the movie is so overpopulated with enough plot holes to create a vortex that'll suck the world into a nightmarish oblivion where this movie still exists, despite how many copies are trashed and burned by the public. And aside from that, the plot itself is so badly convoluted that several attributes of the story are inconsistent throughout the runtime. The latter happens so frequently throughout the film that my head felt like it was going to explode because of all the thought I was putting into the description. Which is actually kind of funny, considering the movie has more explosions in it than definable character and plot traits. Seriously, they're in every action sequence, even if the respective scenes only involve hand-to-hand combat. Generally, when we think of action movies that choose action and explosions over a proper story, the first thing that pops in our head is Michael Bay, namely his Transformers franchise. Well, say what you will about Bay, but believe it or not, when he directs a movie, he's at least treating us with something that's exciting. Not to mention, when it comes to a Bay movie, I at least know exactly what is going on most of the time. In Ballistic, the action's there just to make the movie look good. Other than that, I get the sense that I can just fast forward through the big and intense stuff, and I'd feel like I missed practically nothing to follow what's happening. Earlier, I specified that the film is inconsistent throughout its telling. Well, if you thought I was exaggerating, just you wait until you hear the details for yourself. First, we have the scene where we initially see Ecks, all washed up in a bar. 2 FBI agents approach him, asking him to accompany them out of the premises. Ecks refuses their request, causing a brief and almost comically executed struggle to ensue. Then the agent's boss, Julio Martin, the FBI assistant director, casually walks on screen to relay Ecks with their need for his services. And this begs the question, if Julio was inside the building the whole time, why were the 2 agents so insistent on taking Ecks away from this spot at the counter? Where were they going to take him? To another seat? Julio couldn't have just walked up to him and said, "Hey man, how you doing? Listen, we've got this major situation going down in Canada. You think you can help us out when you get a minute?" There! Done! Was that really so hard? That little detail was only a minor issue involved with the writing. But there's one major form of plot inconsistency that really bugs me every time I try to watch and enjoy the movie. And that little con exists in the identity of our femme fatale, Agent Sever. When we first learn about Sever's kidnapping of Gant's son, Julio and Ecks immediately surmise that she's a quote-unquote disaffected DIA agent who's also orphan class out of China. How they're able to piece that all together just from watching some security footage will forever baffle me. But it's the orphan class part of her backstory that really confuses me. What's orphan class, you ask? Well, according to Ecks, the DIA has this little operation in which they adopt female Chinese orphans, either kids or babies after their family rejects them, and then they raise them to be cold-blooded assassins and killers completely devoid of fear or sense of morality. Putting aside the obvious factoid that no U.S. intelligence agency has ever followed an operation that involves adopting abandoned Asian children with the sole intention of transforming them into evil killers, the whole idea of Sever being raised this way since childhood doesn't follow any kind of logistical steps in the movie at all. Until maybe the midpoint of the movie, we're given the impression that Sever really is this murderous assassin she's been trained and described to be, particularly at around the 30-minute mark, when she has a major shootout outside a shopping mall with a large group of DIA officers working under Gant. I have no idea how she was able to take out every guy she encountered without sustaining even a bruise. Better yet, I'd really like to know how Gant's men managed to track her down to that location. We're never told or hinted how or when they figured this out. Nor are we ever informed why Sever was there in the first place. Was she getting food for Gant's son, who's now her hostage? Was she just getting some exercise? Was there a new Prada bag on sale there? Point is, she turns the outside parking lot into a war zone. She doesn't shoot any civilians, mind you, but she left so many officers dead or wounded, and she didn't share so much as a hint of remorse for the plethora of murders she just committed. So at first glance, she would appear to be playing the part just right. But later on, we realize that Sever once had a husband and an infant son, who were both killed by Gant from a missile strike. Because of that, she now set her sights on assassinating Gant with her own hands, to pay for what he did to her family. Whether this attack from Gant was deliberate or not remains to be specified. The movie hardly even tries to make the right answer properly understood. But putting that aside, I need to address the elephant in the room here. Sever is supposed to be a woman trained to be completely empty of any sort of strong emotions, except for maybe hatred and anger, both of which she already manages to pull off rather successfully. But the fact that she has this backstory that explains that she has this personal vendetta against Gant seems to almost completely weaken the concept of her already pre-established character background. After we find out that she's just out for revenge against Gant, after she lost two people she seemed to love so dearly, her history of her being an individual absolutely incapable of feeling or expressing empathy seems to be practically redundant. Ironically, the idea of Sever kidnapping Gant's son so that she could lure him out and put a bullet in his head is probably the best attribute this movie has to offer. But once again, it's too difficult to take seriously due to the lack of consistent storytelling. Oh, and you're probably wondering why I'm only using still images for this movie review, as opposed to actual clips, like what I did with my previous Zone Fighter retrospective. Well, I did try to save the movie onto my computer so that I could also add some clips for this review. However, little did I realize that my DVD of the movie is so badly encrypted that it was impossible for me to create a file for any of the clips, no matter how hard I tried. Can you believe that? The movie's so bad that not even my computer wants to hold any of the footage. Back to the movie itself. This writing is so incomprehensible that it gives me some of the most malignant migraines I've ever endured in my life, and I wouldn't be surprised if maybe some of the actors felt likewise during the entire shoot. Antonio Banderas, for example. In about half his scenes, I swear, it looks like the guy is struggling to stay awake. Often, when he talks, he speaks with such a quiet monotone, as if he's so bored during his delivery that he couldn't bother to give a solid performance, and trust me when I say that I do not blame him for that at all. Even Lucy Liu looks so disinterested during her large portion of her scenes. Even when she's holding a rifle and firing at people, she just maintains this uninterested gaze the entire time. Now, you could argue that maybe this was done intentionally to seem linear with the character's design of being a soulless, lifeless woman, but as we've already established, the character is not relinquished of any type of emotional values. Her family was murdered, and now she's out for blood against the man who pulled the trigger, so to speak. After the big shootout, Ecks and Sever finally come face to face, where we see our eagerly anticipated epic brawl. And by epic brawl, I mean awkwardly choreographed dance sequence, which doesn't last but barely a minute anyway. And you want to know something else? Even though the movie is called Ecks vs. Sever, this is the only time the title characters ever spar with each other in the entire movie. Are you kidding me? How can it be called a versus movie when the two only fight one time, and just before the midpoint of the flick? Okay, sure, there have been Godzilla movies where the famous monster didn't clash with his titular opposition but one time in the whole movie, but the eponymous fight was reserved for the end of the movie, not only delivering an epic conclusion to the story, but in the meantime, it bided its time in filling in the earlier gaps with a proper story, character development, and even action and suspense scenes that are actually entertaining and memorable. That's more than can be said about Ecks vs. Sever.